I'm Eddie Glaude, and I'm the chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, and welcome to the African American Studies podcast. Today, I'm delighted to have as our guest the one and only Dr. Cornel West, professor of the practice of public philosophy in the Department of African and African American Studies at Harvard University and professor emeritus here at Princeton. Professor West is one of the most influential intellectuals of our time. His scholarship has transformed conversations across a wide range of fields, from Black liberation theology to critical theory and cultural studies to American pragmatism. In so many ways, scholars and intellectuals are still trying to catch up with him. He is the author of over 20 books and 13 edited volumes, classics such as Prophesy Deliverance and The American Evasion of Philosophy, The Ethical Dimensions of Marxism, Keeping Faith, and of course, Race Matters and Democracy Matters, just to name a few. His latest books are Black Prophetic Fire and The Radical King. Professor West is also one of the nation's most important public intellectuals. His insistence on speaking truth to power, on embodying integrity, honesty, decency, and courage on behalf of the most vulnerable, no matter who resides in the White House, has been a model for so many around the country, as well as a thorn in the side of those comfortable walking the corridors of power. It is indeed a privilege and an honor. Welcome, Dr. West.
My dear brother, kind and generous words, though, brother. You think, though, man, it's been almost 30 years.
Almost 30 years,
30
man.
years, holding up the bloodstained banner, trying to be consistent and constant and persistent and trying to tell the truth.
It is amazing, actually. You know, every time I give thanks and praises to God, I thank him for you and what you have meant to me in my life and to so many others. But I really am excited about this conversation for a couple of reasons, but because I think we have an opportunity to just simply, chop it up as we often do in the privacy of our own spaces.
Yeah. Those are precious, precious moments, though, man. Spending time with you over the years, but every week I just learned from you, inspired by you, though, brother.
It's just a reflection of you, Doc. So I want to begin with talking about this life of the mind that you have you've been talking with me about for 30 years, almost 30 years, this idea of what it means to be committed, to be in love with ideas. Talk about how that began. How did it take root in you?
I've been so very blessed to come from such a loving family, a loving church, Shiloh Baptist Church on the one hand, the West family on the other, to be so deeply shaped by coaches like Bill Mahan and John Braxton, and then to have teachers like Martin Kilson and Preston Williams. And Sinclair Drake really is kind of a model in so many ways. And of course the John Rawlses and Stanley Cavell's and Hilary Putnam's and Israel Scheffler's and Robert Nozick's at Harvard, and then the Richard Rorty's and Sheldon Wolin's, Carl Shorsky's and Tim Scanlon's and Tom Nagel's, Walter Kaufman at Princeton. I mean, there's nothing like being shaped by that kind of web of love. And by love, I mean those who are fundamentally committed to love of truth and love of beauty, love of goodness, in my own particular sense, a love of the holy as a revolutionary Christian. And so when you think of that backdrop, there's so much joy that follows from that life of the mind and the world of ideas, to try to cultivate capacity for energy, discipline, and talent, and to use them as forms of weaponry in the struggle for freedom. I am first and foremost a Christian. I'm first and foremost a Christian tied to radical love and radical freedom and love. But that radical love has to do with a hatred of injustice. I love this notion of charitable Christian hatred. You hate the sin and love the sinner. And you hate the injustice, but still love the person who perpetuated it, because they can be changed. They are redeemable. They can always be transformed by something greater than me. So I am full of a lot of righteous indignation. I mean, a lot of people actually call me a hater. And I say, you're absolutely right, that when you love people, you hate the fact they're being treated unjustly. You loathe the fact that they're being treated unfairly. And if you don't do something, the rocks are going to cry out. That is, for me, part and parcel of a certain kind of calling, a certain kind of vocation.
You always do this whenever you speak around the country or whenever you talk about yourself. You point to those who have poured something so significant into you. You used a phrase not too long ago that I've heard you use it before, but not so much in this way: a revolutionary piety. So there's always this kind of public acknowledgement of your indebtedness to the sources of the sources who've made you who you are.
Absolutely.
Now it's interesting because it's a reflection of a side of you that most people might not think about, and it is your deep connection to tradition, your understanding. I mean, it's from Gadamer to Edward Shields. I mean, there's this kind of. So talk a little.
Two fundamental figures.
Exactly. So talk a little.
Truth and Method. Shields' great work on tradition.
So talk a little bit about that.
Well, the finest analysis we have of piety was written by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel in the first piece he ever wrote in English. And he talks about the three pillars of piety: remembrance, reverence, and resistance. And he talks about piety itself as subversive in that sense. But you always begin by remembering. You always begin by the remembering, the gathering of the dismembered elements of the past that need to be able to be brought to bear in a nightmarish present in order to hold on to some vision of a better future, let alone the actualization of that better future. So that for me, piety, the indebtedness of the sources of good in our lives and our brief moves from our mama's womb to tomb. Mm-hmm. And during that short time and space, the memories that can somehow connect us to a reverence beyond just the idols, the fetishes, the brands, the chronic self-promotions and the raw ambitions, something deeper than that. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the resistance against those same idols and fetishes of our day.
You will invoke Sheldon Wolin's distinction between vocation and invocation as another way of getting at that. Talk a little, because Wolin is so important to you as well.
Oh, Sheldon, yeah, my thesis advisor, and God rest his soul, was one of probably the greatest radical democratic political theorists the latter part of the 20th century in the American empire. And when he talked about vocation, he went back to Martin Luther, Beruf. He talked about Weber, vocation, what it is to have a calling. But then there's no vocation without invocation. There's no calling without also a recalling and remembering of those grand figures. He's in some way tied to the highbrow humanist tradition of which I'm a part, that highlights exemplars, exemplary figures who intervene in one's present by means of the life of the mind that allow you touchstones and milestones, high standards of excellence, or haratei in the language of the Greeks, the high standards of excellence that give you a sense of what it is to strive to something grander than you in the lives that they lived.
Yeah. So I mean, and when you locate yourself in this kind of high humanist tradition, there's some serious folk that you invoke. I mean, going from Erasmus all the way, even
well, it begins with Socrates and Jesus.
Yeah,
absolutely. It begins with Socrates on the one hand and Amos and Jesus on the other. And of course, with Socrates, there's always the
Athens and Jerusalem,
the pre-existent and antecedent conditions going back to Egypt and other African civilizations, but especially the intellectual integrity of Socrates, the unleashing of critical consciousness, of questioning, of interrogation, the willingness to have the courage to follow arguments even when they go in places you don't want to go, and the painful truths of coming to terms with who you are. And then Jesus himself, building on the prophetic Judaism that produced him. He's very much a prophetic Judaic figure, but at the same time opening it up to the world in terms of the unleashing of a love of neighbor and a love of enemy that puts one at risk, that leads toward a cross, that exemplifies a way of love in which to be what's the right word, to empty oneself and to be emptied by others in such a way that when you are on that cross, you have some kinds of traces that you can point to impact that you've had on the souls of others. There's something that's quite sublime about that. And of course, you see that sublimity in Spinoza, the great excommunicated Jewish thinker who was secular to the core, who loved the example of Jesus in the Quran as well. There's so many folk who see his sublimity who are not necessarily Christian, or Chekhov himself, of course, who was a great agnostic, but who could go to church and cry and say the Passion, the Eucharist, is too beautiful to be true. Echoes of George Santayana. That unbelievable sense of self-investment in a life of trying to love, pursuing justice, but recognizing that the ways of the world will, for the most part, always try to crush it by means of character assassination, literal assassination, misinformation, misinterpretation of what you and the movement that you're a part of is trying to do. Martin King is the grandest example, and of course, John Coltrane, Mary Lou Williams are the great artistic exemplars of what I'm talking about within my own tradition, the Black freedom tradition.
Right. So that, there's talk of your genius and it's evidence of your genius, but that it is actually a result of an extraordinary discipline and dedication to your craft. Talk a little bit about your habits of reading. You are first and foremost a reader.
Absolutely. No, that's true.
So all the times folks walking around here thinking, seeing, watching you speak and listening to you speak, at the core of who you are, Irene and Clifton West, who made you who you are, Shiloh Baptist, who made you.
Willie P. Cook, Deacon Hinton,
you
Sarah
are a reader.
That's exactly
So
right.
talk a little bit about your habits of reading.
Well, there's a sense in which I'm committed to the dialogical, and that dialogical commitment has to do with commitment to reading, especially the great texts of the dead, as well as some of the texts of the living. I think the greatest texts that have been written tend to be those who are dead, as opposed to the quick. But it doesn't mean that you downplay the quick who are serious, or build on the best of the dead. But for me, it's a matter of soul craft. It's a matter of orienting myself in such a way that I could generate visions and virtues and values that if enacted in the right way, can lead toward a better life. Because I don't fetishize texts, and texts for me are simply ways in which persons can live better lives. And by engaging these texts, you become more courageous, more critical, more compassionate, more sacrificial. So in that sense, it's like Shakespeare's The Tempest. All of these plays actually mean little if the plays themselves don't try to get you to live your life as a work of art. Don't fetishize the art itself by being a spectator and just acknowledging the genius of Shakespeare, but rather to make a choice to try to live your life in such a way that your life becomes a work of art. So these plays help enable and empower you to be a walking work of art. And see, that's part of the genius of Shakespeare. But that's true for Duke Ellington. I think it's true for Donny Hathaway.
It reminds me of Hadot, right? I mean, this is this.
Oh yeah,
art
Pierre
of living.
Hadot, philosophy of the way of life. Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, he associates it with spiritual exercises, so that spiritual exercise is part and parcel with the Greeks call paideia, which is that deep education, that soul change, that soul transformation, that shifting of the soul from the world of becoming to the world of being, from the world of the surface to the world of depth, most importantly from the world of the superficial to the world of the substantial, those things that really matter: life, death, joy, love, trust, intellectual dialogue for personal and social transformation.
So that's the motivation to get to the books. That's what lies behind the reading. But there is a discipline that attends it. I mean, no matter how busy you are, you are reading.
Read 3 hours every night. No, there's no doubt about that. I just feel incomplete.
You just feel incomplete.
Oh yeah,
goes all the way back when your mother had to take your glasses away from you to keep you
glasses from the bookmobile. No, that's very, very true. That's
right.
Very, and for me, the reading is much more important than the writing. I mean, writing itself can become just another form of narcissism, another form of obsession with self-presentation in such a way that people can see how smart you are and acknowledge your smartness. And I can't stand the culture of smartness. I can't stand neoliberal soulcraft that says the best thing that ever happens to anybody is to be the smartest person in the room, as opposed to being wise, courageous, and compassionate. The smartness culture and the neoliberal soulcraft is just another product of late capitalist civilization that somehow tries to get us to fall in place to the prevailing idols rather than crush the idols and stay in contact with the best of the past. And usually the best wisdom that we know comes from the dead. Mm-hmm. The living, in and of themselves, don't have a whole lot to offer. They've got to be in conversation and dialogue with the best towering figures and movements of the past.
You're always referencing artists. You always kind of turn to the poets.
Absolutely.
Because in the argument between the poets and the philosophers, you side with the poets.
Absolutely.
And it's clear. But, you once told me in passing, I don't know if you remember this, that you read novels slowly. You don't read them as quickly as you read other things. Why is that the case? Why does it take you? Why are you more, I wouldn't say you're more deliberate, but it takes a little longer to finish a novel than it does.
Yeah, especially a Toni Morrison novel. But not just Toni, but James Joyce or Proust or any of the great ones. Well, first, I fundamentally believe that artists are the vanguard of the species. I think we are the kind of species, the kind of organic creatures or kind of organisms with language that we are the highest levels of our courage and the lowest depths of our love is manifest in those who take us to the edge of life's abyss, who are willing to invest everything in who they are into a product that would lead toward their being emptied out, but to lead toward art being filling up. And it's the artists who do that, not just musicians, but the painters and the writers and the poets in the broadest sense, what the Germans call Dichter. Mm-hmm. Those who have the imagination and empathy to conceive of an alternative reality, given the nightmarish reality that all of us have to deal with in our death sentence in space and time. And so in that sense, philosophers can become artists. I've got my David Hume right here. This is Dialogues on Natural Religion. That's one of the great works of art in the English language, written by a philosopher, a comic philosopher who's preoccupied with incongruity and inconsistency and contradictions.
And Cavell.
And Stanley Cavell, who's someone writing on Emerson in that way. But Wittgenstein would be another, Kierkegaard, of course, another, Adorno, another within the European tradition. And there's literary artists who are deeply philosophical. I mentioned Toni Morrison, but I would say Lorraine Hansberry is one of the underappreciated persons who had a deep philosophic orientation. Her rewriting of Waiting for Godot, Waiting for Top Dog, Waiting for Toe Dog, critique of that towering late modernist playwright Samuel Beckett. And there is this genius from Southside Chicago in her late 20s, early 30s, taking him on as a revolutionary humanist as she was, as well as student of W.B. Du Bois and others. Same would be true with Gwendolyn Brooks. We can go on with figures who understand the way in which the philosophic and the poetic are tied together. Souls of Black Folk is one of the great examples of that, the classic in 1903. What my tradition is one in which I read novels slowly, because there's a semantic density, there's a thickness of meaning that you don't want to miss. You're never able to capture all of it, but you don't want to miss, and therefore it takes so much more time. Now, you read more novels than I do, brother. You read the Latin American, the African novelists, and so forth and so on, and I wish I had the time to be able to follow through on so many of the novelists that you read all the time as a philosopher and as a social critic. But the poets, I do try to read much more of the Jeffrey Hills, who take a long time to read. Very, very difficult, but very profound. Very profound.
There's this wonderful juxtaposition in your work, and it's not, juxtaposition is not the right word. It's this integrated density to your own work, and where there's a kind of deep reading in the European tradition, what you describe as this kind of high humanist tradition that you can map out.
Absolutely.
And then there is this kind of deep reading in the African American sources. Right? And there's a way in which you bring these two together that has kind of defined the arc of your work since the first book. the edited volume on Black theology, to the prophesied deliverance, to American event. There's a way in which you're bringing these traditions together that really fascinates me. And how do you think about the relationship between these sources of the sources that make you who you are? And let me say a little bit more about what I mean.
Yeah.
So there's a way in which, and this is what angered me with Mike Dyson's rendering
God
of you in the
bless
New
that
Republic.
brother.
Bless him.
God bless that brother.
But
Yeah.
there's a way in which you have transformed conversations in so many different areas. I mentioned this in the introduction. So the way in which you bring Marxism to bear, right, or your Marxian thinking to bear on Black liberation theological discourses, right, when you were very young, and how you were impacting that conversation, and the way in which you, in some ways, transformed and pushed Cone and others to think about the material conditions for the production of theological reflection. Or do you think about the ways in which you were engaging in conversations with folk who were just now reading Foucault, just reading, Parsons gave you Foucault, right?
Sure did.
Right when he was
did.
first translated,
As an
right?
undergrad, Otaka Parsons.
And the
Yeah,
way
God
in which
bless
you
his
were
soul.
thinking about critical theory and cultural studies at a moment where it was taking off, and how you were having an impact by bringing the conversation of race and placing it at the center as you were reading these folk, as you were pushing James, as you were pushing Paul Beauvais, those folks up at Pittsburgh and the like. And then, of course, the American pragmatist tradition. You write a story. You tell a story of its beginnings that fundamentally re-narrates it in order to highlight its blindnesses. And then you introduce figures who weren't necessarily central to how folks thought about that tradition. Talk a little bit about that methodological approach, the way in which you bring these various sources to bear on how you think and how you write.
I think it has much to do with the legacy of the greatest public intellectual in the American empire in the 20th century, W.B. Du Bois. He's got a lot of competition with John Dewey and Edmund Wilson and Susan Sontag and Muriel Rukeyser and Lionel Trilling and others. But for me, there's a BC and an AD. To be post-Du Boisian, after Du Bois, is to begin with a internationalism, a cosmopolitanism, in which you keep track of civilizations, how they relate to each other, but also come to terms with empire. So, for example, when I was coming along and first reading James Baldwin, but especially Ralph Ellison, they both had tremendous impact on me, and Albert Murray, too, to a significant degree. And they were so concerned with looking at Black people in the context of American culture, what I'd call American civilization. And it was fascinating. It was very important. But I always thought that was too parochial, because I think America itself has a parochialism and a provincialism. It has magnificent things like energy, mobility, obsession with futurity, the future. But it still has its own blind spots and undersides of indigenous peoples' treatment, genocidal attacks, theft of land, as well as slavery and domestic households being patriarchal, women confined to those private spaces, white working men without property not being able to vote. But I was always concerned with the issues of empire and the issues of what it is to be part of a civilization that is usually connected in complicated ways with other civilizations. So that when they would say, well, Black culture is really fundamentally a part of American culture, I would say, well, yes, that's true, but that's not the compliment that you think it is. It's a great insight, we accept it, but to move toward American nationalism without being internationalist itself is still too narrow. So even in 1982, as you rightly note, and that's 35 years ago in Prophesied Deliverance, which was my first text, I was much more concerned with trying to connect the rich, deep, profound Black tradition of the doing and sufferings of these New World Africans and the shaping of both themselves, their culture, their communities, as well as American civilization, but also modernity. Also human history. And that's Du Bois's great move. Du Bois is the great public intellectual concerned about empire. And that's very, very rare. I mean, Cedric Robinson is another who comes to mind in that regard. Gerald Horn comes to mind in that regard. But we don't have a lot. Most are settled into the U.S. context when we talk about black folk.
Yeah.
And a lot of it had to do with my Christian sensibility. To be a Christian and to live a life in which you choose a way of the cross makes you a radical internationalist who wants to turn the world upside down, because every human being, no matter what color, what national identity, no matter what sexual orientation, made in the image and likeness of God. So you view nationalism itself as a kind of ideological species of idolatry,
right.
Even given the fact that democracy comes into the modern world in the nutshell of the nation state. Therefore, you have to deal with nations if you're going to try to democratize in any serious way. And the same would be true with the impact of Marxist analysis for me. That Karl Marx himself was first and foremost a radical internationalist who wanted to turn the world upside down because he saw capitalist civilizations as promoting ubiquitous commodification of everything and everybody. Everybody for sale, everything for sale, which is very much where we are now in American civilization, with its capitalism run amok and its white supremacy out of control, let alone its president out of control and over his head. So that my own shaping and molding was an internationalism that cuts radically against the grain of the academy, the division of knowledge in the academy tends to be one in which international affairs is on the side, and in which the disciplines themselves are very much locked into the nation state and nationalism as much more important than an internationalist perspective, let alone an anti-imperialist perspective.
So some would periodize it differently. You said there's a BC and there's an AD. With Du Bois, someone would say there's a before Cornel West and there's an after Cornel West. No. There's there are different sorts of questions that are asked prior to you and then after you. Different sorts of ways of imagining how to do this work before Cornel West and then after Cornel West. So there's an interesting kind of moment. We've talked about, habits of reading, how you imagine the life of the mind. Then Race Matters hits.
Which is a fluke. It was just fluke. Sister Deborah Chapman just saw some essays sitting on the floor and put them together.
I was here when I was here as a graduate student when Race Matters hit, and it was a phenomenal moment. I remember when remember that show on Rock, and they invoked the book on Rock's show.
Yeah, that was an honor.
And in some ways, you became the darling of white liberals.
Oh, yes. Dangerous position.
Talk a little bit about that for you.
Absolutely.
For yourself.
Well, one, of course, again, the text itself was a fluke with Deborah Chapman just finding some essays on the floor and putting them together. But the visibility of the text had everything to do with the rebellion of the black masses in Los Angeles responding to Rodney King, where the vicious legacy of white supremacy had to be taken seriously. And when you have such moments, very like our moment now, the white power structure wants to select certain individuals and certain texts that become the focus, because you're going to have some public conversation about race. You remember the piece in New York Times Magazine on Princeton's public intellectual back in 1992, right when the rebellion was taking place, and then the text takes off. And I did become the darling of the white liberal establishment for a very quick time. It only lasted about 9 months or a year because of my association with Louis Farrakhan with the Million Man March, Ben Chavis, the three of us traveling around the country. And we being very honest about our disagreements, but also being honest that the plight of black Americans, specifically the plight of black brothers, was one that had to be addressed. And though I've always had my differences and disagreements with my dear brother, Mr. Louis Farrakhan, I've always been willing to work with a variety of different persons who are highlighting certain kinds of issues, in this case, the impact of white supremacy on the black community and the impact of white supremacy on the heart and souls of precious black brothers. So to be associated with Louis Farrakhan in Ivy League schools at that time, of course, was a deadly or a poisonous thing. And I was very explicit about it, that I'm a free black man. I'm a Jesus-loving free black man. So I love who I want to love. I associate who I want to associate with. So I had some very vicious attacks at that time. Of course, vicious attacks escalated in a variety of different ways.
No, I remember Brother Sean Willins and Michael Walzer
and
Leon
others. You
Weasel
supporting
Tier.
fascism. This
Absolutely.
is the black Mussolini. At this march, we're going to get vicious attacks on precious Jewish brothers and sisters right after. I said, no, it's not like that at all. It's not like that at all. And they turned out to be wrong. Totally wrong in that sense.
Right.
But that was just the beginning. But what happens is there is a very rich tradition. I think of Du Bois himself. I think of James Baldwin. I think of Gwendolyn Brooks. I think of Amiri Baraka. I think of Gwendolyn Brooks. They had all been the darlings of the white liberal establishment early in their careers. Mm-hmm. And as they followed through and became more radicalized in terms of them willing to speak truths that were uncomfortable for the white liberals turned on them viciously. And you just look at each one of their careers. Ishmael Reed, I think, is also a fascinating case in that regard. He had a lot of courage. And it's a difficult situation because it's very hard for a black intellectual to reach any level of success in the white liberal mainstream anyway. And so once you get there, you have to make a choice. Are you going to opt for integrity or are you going to opt for popularity? You see, Leroy Jones could have remained Leroy Jones and been the darling of white liberals. Mm-hmm. Du Bois could have done that. James Baldwin, certainly. The fire next time they loved him, no name in the street, they hate him. Mm-hmm. He's the same lovely Jimmy, telling his truth, but he's got to come to terms with the death of Malcolm. And
so here we are now.
And others. Here we are, 2017. Same kind of phenomena. Yeah. You got the neoliberal white establishment trots out its darlings. And they become, bestsellers. They become highly visible. They become persons that many people argue are the only voices. And you say, no, there's never the only voices or primary voices. Most of them won't tell fundamental truths. Mm-hmm. Drone strikes, Israeli occupation of Palestinians. There's certain issues they won't touch with a 10-foot pole precisely because those are the issues that the white liberal establishment won't touch with a 10-foot pole in any critical way, you see. And so, but the wonderful thing is that with Black Lives Matter and the awakening that's taking place, spiritual moral awakening among the younger generation, that they know, who's for real and who's phony. So in that sense, there is a certain kind of hope that we have in terms of truth tellers.
Right. So there's Black Lives Matter. Right. And then there's this kind of this interesting convergence, the ascendance of Trump and the ascendance of Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book. How do you in your mind make sense of this against the backdrop of the election of the first African American president? You've caught a lot of hell out here over the last 8 years, truth telling, trying to shout from the rooftops about what was happening, not just simply not just simply among Black America, but in the country and across the globe. While we were kind of all excited about a Black man in the White House, you were keeping track of this question of justice and this issue of love, and that motivated you to continue to bring critique to bear on Obama's presidency. And then, of course, you get the ascendance of Trump, and then this phenomenon of between the world and me and these young folk in the streets. How do you make sense of all of this as a person who has in some ways been thinking about the American empire for a long time?
Well, I tell you, though, after Reagan and the Bushes, Black people were at levels of desperation, looking for any symbol and sign of hope, and the very notion of there being a successful Black president, in the sense of a president who wins and goes to the White House with a precious Black family, and brilliant Black wife, and beautiful Black children. It was unimaginable And so when it took place, the impact on Black America, of course, was it was unprecedented. And it's understandable because the depth of desperation, we oftentimes have very low expectations. And when those expectations are exceeded by a Black family going to a White House primarily built by Black people, it was overwhelming. But the result was what? The result was our leaders, our politicians, our spokespersons, and our intellectuals began to revel in that symbolic celebration, even as it reinforced a concrete hibernation. And what I mean by that is symbolic break dancing, but on the ground sleepwalking. So you no longer made any demands. Your Socratic energy was attenuated. No serious critiques. Now, as an internationalist, when I was concerned about drone strikes, where a baby in Yemen and Pakistan and Afghanistan has exactly the same value as a Black baby or white baby or red baby in the United States, nobody really wanted to highlight it in the way in which they ought. There's Jeremy Scahill and others, Medea Benjamin and others who were talking about this, but I had to be part and parcel of that. Why? Well, that's the King legacy. A Vietnamese baby got the same value as a Black, brown, or red, a yellow baby. Same was true with relation with Wall Street. Same was true in relation to the national security state, the national surveillance state. So that when you think, oh my God, Barack Obama is dropping over 20,000 bombs every year on 7 Muslim countries with a peace prize, that's a contradiction. That needs to be pointed out. Well, Brother West, that's no, because Fox News coming at him, right wing's coming at him. We got to protect him. And so we saw it with Sharpton, Dyson, Melissa, Harris Perry, and the others. They became the protectorates. They became the cheerleaders. You say, no, the role of serious intellectuals who are concerned about Black suffering, poor people suffering, working people suffering, is to tell the truth. Conditional truth allows suffering to speak. Mm-hmm. So you got a Black president, and Dyson called him Pharaoh for a few weeks, changed his mind, and became a cheerleader. You say, oh, okay, well, what's the grounds for the shift, right?
But how do you respond to people who say that that it was the fact that he didn't extend tickets to the inauguration, the Chris Hedges interview, or that exactly. if you had access to him, you wouldn't be so critical. How do you or people say that your language, right, the rhetoric, he is a Rockefeller Republican in blackface.
Street. He turned out to be a puppet of Wall Street. That's why no Wall Street executives went to jail.
How do you respond to people saying that the harshness of your critique?
Well, there's no doubt that there's an intensity and harshness because right when everyone else is celebrating, the last thing you want to use is polite language and sweet language when it's the harshness that allows what you have to say to stand out and be reckoned with. Why? Because the harshness of the language pales in light of the harshness of the conditions. Right? We put the pressure on them to say something about the new Jim Crow. Thank God Michelle Alexander and others and her secular, her classic texts for the movement, building on Angela Davis and Glenn Lowry and the others who were concerned about new Jim Crow for decades. You had to use a harsh language in order to try to wake people up. That's one of the role of hyperbolic language, to wake people up and to recognize just how ugly and vicious these conditions are.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And so you talked about Black child poverty. 1 out of 2 Black children under 6 living in utter poverty, and he didn't give one speech dealing with poverty in general, let alone child poverty, let alone Black child poverty. And yet Black folk giving him a pass. Yeah. And Black folk now, we understand what it meant to give him a pass.
Right.
You know what I mean? You say, oh, okay, he's so successful. Is that all you wanted, with just Black success at the top rather than trying to attenuate Black suffering on the bottom? Inequality still increased. All the jobs, 94% of the jobs were low pay, precarious, contingent jobs. Right. But Wall Street breaking records, stock market breaking records. So what happens is that we move into a neo-fascist era as the neoliberal era of Obama came to a close with an unbelievable level of disappointment. Either rationalized by saying he wanted to do more, but the right wing wouldn't allow him. No, he had 2 years. It was all Democrats. Right? Still unable to deal in any serious way with the levels of social misery of poor and working people. He didn't support the Employment Free Choice Act that would have helped trade unions. He did succumb to the Wall Street bailout without there being a bailout for homeowners. For homeowners, what is it? 250,000 black homeowners. And you pointed out in your powerful text, Democracy in Black. Depression. No sense of emergency there at all. So I had to go on and on. They said, oh, Brother West, it's just a personal matter. He didn't give you tickets. Well, after doing 65 events for the brother, all I asked was for a ticket for my mother anywhere. You know, MSNBC spreading lies, talking about I had to be in the first few rows. That's a lie. I figured my mother's 70-some years old. She ought to see the first black president. I'll take her to do it. I did 65 events. Never heard a word from him. Never heard any possibility of her being there. So I just took her anyway, but we couldn't go. Is that wrong? I think he was wrong. There's no doubt about that. And I love my mother. But that ain't got nothing to do with my critique.
Right.
Ain't got nothing to do with the truth telling. Lay out the evidence. Let me see how he was critical of Wall Street in a substantive way as opposed to Wall Street breakdancing. Let me see the ways in which he was addressing the new Jim Crow, not just by going to some deodorized space in the prison after 7 years, but hitting the issue head on. Retrospectively, if you're going to sign a bill that allows for some reduction in terms of the crack cocaine vis-a-vis regular cocaine punishments and so on. No, it was clear he's a neoliberal president, no matter what color he is. And neoliberalism is what? Steal the transfer of wealth from poor and working people to the 1% with privatizing and financializing and militarizing the police department. New movement, Black Lives Matter under a black president who needed to be reminded Black Lives Matter.
So now we have the neo-fascists.
Now the neo-fascists in place.
As you say, the gangster in the White House.
I'm telling you.
And you have been strong as usual in this regard.
No,
so what do we...
Brother Donald Trump is a gangster in character and a neo-fascist in content. And what I mean by that is when you're grabbing private parts of a woman and bragging about it, that's gangster. When you're saying you go into Iraq and take their oil, that's gangster. Those are just two examples of what it is to be. And gangster is what? Eclipse of integrity, honesty, decency, obsessed with the 11th commandment, thou shalt not get caught, thinking you can do anything, living a life of impunity. That is Brother Donald Trump. A life of impunity. Say anything and do anything with no accountability, no answerability. But the neo-fascist content is connected to Steve Bannon and company. There is not just disregard of rule of law, disregard of Constitution, but it's big business, big corporations with an ideology that scapegoats the most vulnerable, our precious Muslims, our precious Mexicans, our precious transgender folk and black folk and Jews. Now it gets complicated with our Jewish brothers and sisters because you got vicious anti-Jewish contempt shot through the Breitbart-like ideological orientation.
Right.
But you also have the embrace of Israeli elites. Now, I never confuse Israeli elites with Jewish brothers and sisters as a whole. They're two different things. The elites, right wing, Netanyahu, comes out of Jabotinsky's tradition, very different than Albert Einstein, very different than Judah Magnus, very different from progressive Jews within the Zionist movement. And then you got the Noam Chomskys, who are critical of Zionism as a whole. But he is as Jewish as Netanyahu.
Right, right.
He's just more right on the question of Israel needing to be needing to lift the occupation or to allow Palestinians to live lives of decency and dignity with either a state of their own, and now whether that's even possibly is open. But the crucial thing is we have to have a double love. We got to love our precious Jewish brothers and sisters. We got to love our precious Palestinian brothers and sisters. That's the Martin Luther King Jr.-like challenge, and that's what it is to tell the truth. Now, when it comes to those kind of issues, then you're not going to get either a Coates or a Dyson and others to hit those head on. They're going to stay concerned only about the U.S. context and the ways in which race and white supremacy must be radically called into question. And they're right about that. But, of course, in terms of their action, Dyson, of course, cheerleader for the president up until the end. He had to rebrand, and now he's posing as if he's a major critic during those 8 years. So that's not true. That's a lie. He was very much a cheerleader, you see. Coates was a kind of embedded reporter. You read the long essay in Atlantic.
My Black President.
My Black President. He's traveling with the president. He's embedded. No serious critique other than respectability politics here, a little issue there. You know, and you got Jelani Cobb and the others want to act as if makes him a major critic. No, that's not major criticism at all. That's nibbling on the edges. But why? Because in fact, what you see in Coates's essay is what? That moment in the essay when he says, I was just overwhelmed. I was touched at the deepest level when the president walked into a room and white people had to respect him so much. And you say, oh, is that what black freedom's all about? It's just white respect and white approval and white embrace of who you are? Isn't black freedom very much about making sure white fears, insecurities, and anxieties are secondary and tertiary and putting black dignity and black decency and black integrity and black freedom at the center of it? That's the difference between Malcolm X and Carl Rowan. And if you want Carl Rowan's legacy, then you look at Coates and Dyson, because they're preoccupied with the white concern. Here's a letter to the white. This is making sure the white liberals feel good about themselves because they can see how racist they still are. You call for reparations, you're right. Do you follow through with a black president? No comment, he says. What do you mean no comment? You make a case for reparation, you need to bring the case to the president, whoever it is. No, I'm not going that far. That lacks courage.
Right.
That lacks more courage, you see? So that the legacy of Du Bois, the legacy of Malcolm and Fannie Lou and Ella Baker, let alone Curtis Mayfield and John Coltrane, is the black humanity, black freedom being the lens through which you view things. And you can love others, of course, no matter what color they are. We're internationalists, no matter what. Myself is Christian. But the starting point is very interesting in terms of your intellectual work.
So we got a sense of that black prophetic fire right there, Doc. So
that's why I wrote that book, that love letter to the younger generation. Keep track of Frederick Douglass and Du Bois and Ella Baker and Ida B. Wells and Martin and Malcolm. We need them now more than ever. Your work on James Baldwin, we need him more than ever.
Well, there is this, as we come to a close, there's something that I think when we talk about the periodization, and BC before Du Bois and after Du Bois, or AD, and then BC before Cornel West and after Cornel West. What advice, what words of wisdom would you offer to young folk who are in love with the life of the mind, who are voracious readers, who find themselves communing with the dead in the ways that you've described, but who yet want to think in public with others, who want to bear witness to truth? I know you're fond of talking about the 4 questions that Mansart asked.
Yeah.
What will you say? What can you say to those who are coming after you, who want to pursue your questions, those questions that have animated your work, who want to model the kind of fire that you have demonstrated over the course of this amazing life and career that you've had?
I say we got to learn from the ancestors. We need ancestor appreciation. If you keep track of Gwendolyn Brooks or John Coltrane, they taught us not to confuse vocation with ambition, not to confuse calling with your career. Right now, opportunism, careerism, raw ambition, and chronic self-promotion tend to be the dominant mode of intellectual work in general and the dominant mode of black intellectual work. So you can be highly talented. You can be even a person of genius, but if you use your talent and genius for your self-promotion and for your careerism and opportunism, then you're not going to be courageous, and therefore you're not going to be an exemplar. And by exemplar, I mean, for example, Emerson's representative men. We can talk about representative women. There are persons who, because of integrity, honesty, decency, and courage, held on to their vocations and their callings, so that the careerism and opportunism that affects all of us didn't become predominant. So your conception of success didn't trump your ability to be great. And greatness in all of its forms, but especially in its spiritual and moral forms of being true to the best of who you are in light of what you're called to do, not what a power structure tries to shape you to do or some establishment tries to give you approval for doing. And that means in the end it is a kind of anti-establishment sensibility, but it's an anti-establishment sensibility that still allows you to exist in any context. You can be in a variety of different contexts and be true to the best of who you are. It will get you in trouble, but at least you'll be able to, one, sleep better at night, and most importantly, when it comes to your funeral and your body's in the coffin, they won't just talk about how great your resume was, but they'll talk about how loving and courageous your life was. That's ultimate. That's grandmama criteria.
Yeah. Well, Doc, you know, as Du Bois said in 1951, he bowed before the storm, but he did not break.
Didn't break. Yeah, that's the great Du Bois. And he's wrong on Stalin, he's wrong on Mao, but he loved us. And his love for black people, his love for oppressed people in so many ways, especially on the Western side of things, and in Africa and other places, allowed him not to break. And we love him for that.
Well, we love you. We love you for everything that you have done and you continue to do. So, Doc, so thank you for joining me with this discussion today. It's been amazing.
Brother, I salute you. And you part of the great tradition we talking about. Indeed, indeed. It's a beautiful thing to have students all around the country and the world who try to keep track of the best of you. I got a lot of the worst in me, and folk sometimes imitate the worst, even when they're students, you know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
But lo and behold, you know, we all try to do the best that we can, but we have to be very honest and candid even when we fall on our faces and bounce back.
Well, thank you once again for taking the time.
Thank you, my brother.
Additionally, I want a special thanks to Courtney Bryan for providing the music for this podcast, to the staff of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, our office manager, April Peters, our event coordinator, Dion Worthy, our social media specialist, Allison Bland, and our technical specialist and audio engineer, Elio Leo. Remember, you can find this podcast and more by visiting our website, aas.princeton.edu. Take care.